The method of science is well known: observation, hypothesis, prediction, and experiment. And then we see if the results of the experiment match the prediction. We say the hypothesis is supported. If it isn't, we reject the hypothesis and start with a revised hypothesis, a new prediction, and a new experiment. And we were told by Karl Popper in the last century that the nature of scientific knowledge had to be falsifiable, approximative, empirical, and replicable, and so much more. For in science, authority rests in the rational empirical method, not an individual or a theory of belief. And science flourishes where there is freedom and access. And if you think of the scientific method that we just described, it was put down in writing by the great Ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazan as he is known in the West, who in the 10th century said we must rely on experiment rather than on past authority. I do not care what Aristotle wrote, I care what my eyes will see and my hands can measure by experiment. And so he said, on taking evidence over authority, he who searches for truth is not he who reviews the works of the ancients. It is he who follows argument and evidence, not the statement by an individual who is inevitably affected by context and imperfection. And he did many experiments on optics, and also looking, in this case, he's looking at what appears to be a bent rod simply because of attraction of the water. His studies on detailed analysis of the eye was known, and he actually was the first to say that we see because of light rays bouncing off bodies and entering the eye, and this gave his optics a very modern twist. Now, Ibn al-Haytham's scientific method, the empirical scientific method, is way ahead by centuries from what would be articulated as the experimental method, such as by Bacon, Descartes, and Galileo later on. So on the experimental method, here is what Ibn al-Haytham describes in the 10th century. We start by observing reality. We try to select solid, unchanging observations that are not affected by how we perceive or measure them. We then proceed by increasing our research and measurement, subjecting premises to criticism, and being cautious in drawing conclusions. In all we do, our purpose should be balanced, not arbitrary, the search for truth, not support of opinions. And Ibn al-Haytham also warned against the danger of human bias. Yet we are but human, subject to human frailties, against which we must fight with all our human might. God help us in all our endeavors. For those who think that this is not really needed, remember Paul Broca, in the 19th century, a brilliant scientist, but whose biases affected his work on measuring the brains of different races of humans. And there are magnificent works about that, both by more recent scientists who showed how biases can affect the work that may seem precise but is really affected by bias. So in science, authority rests in the rational empirical method, not an individual or a theory or a belief. And science flourishes where there is freedom and access. Recall Galileo's trial in 1633. Galileo was forced to recant. Now, real freedom of scientific debate, such as that which existed early on in the ancient library of Alexandria, and the freedom of scientific debate that continued in the Muslim world all the way to the early Ottomans, would include enormous openness. So, Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, who was a great philosopher, poet, blind man living in a small village between Aleppo and Damascus, contemporary of Ibn al-Haytham, would attack all religions. Among the things he said, the world holds two classes of men: intelligent men without religion and the religious men without intelligence. He said much more than that. He held an atheistic views, but in spite of it, he was and is still regarded as one of the greatest classical Arabic poets and philosophers. Nobody attacked him. His works were not banned. They arrived till our day today, and he was known in his time, and his contemporaries would say he is a great poet and a great linguist, but I disagree with his views on religion. For he would say things like, do not suppose the statements of the prophets to be true. They are all fabrications. Men lived comfortably till they came and spoiled life. The sacred books are only such a set of idle tales as any age would have and indeed did actually produce. Now, in 2013, almost 1,000 years after his death, the Al-Nusra Front, a branch of Al-Qaeda, came and beheaded the statue of Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri during the Syrian civil war. How different was the situation in the 10th century, where the real Abu al-Ala was left blind as he was, an easy victim for anybody who would have attacked him, but honored and revered and respected, and even his writings, his most terrible writings, were not banned and kept at the time. Ibn al-Nafis, the discoverer of the circulation that we talked about, author of Magisterial al-Shamil, look what he says about the contrarian view. When hearing something unusual, do not preemptively reject it, for that would be folly. Indeed, horrible things may be true, and familiar and praised things may prove to be lies. Truth is truth unto itself, not because many people say it is. It is a great period of the golden age of Islam, but it was to receive a dramatic blow that was countered somewhat by the courage of a scientist. Hulagu, grandson of Genghis Khan, carried the Mongol invasions all the way to Baghdad. And in 1258, the fall of Baghdad to the armies of Hulagu was a terrible event. The House of Wisdom, the great libraries, etc. were all destroyed, and people were killed, and their skulls were made into pyramids. And Nasir-ad-Din al-Tusi went to see Hulagu and told him, "Sire, your place in history will not be marked by the cities you have destroyed, but by the science that you have patroned." He convinced him to build the Maragha Observatory that became a famous school. Maragha is in northwest Iran, what would be northwest Iran today. And Al-Tusi himself was a brilliant man in many, many different fields, but primarily in terms of mathematics and astronomy. And among other things that he did was he developed what is known as the Tusi couple. Now that is written here, as you can see. This is explained from a manuscript, a medieval manuscript, but here it is. It shows how a linear and limited movement back and forth can be part of a continuous and circular movement. That was important for the observation of the movement of the stars. And he also showed that by changing the position and the size of the smaller and larger circles and the connections between them, you could actually derive practically all the different forms of elliptical bodies. And Muslim scholarship continued from Andalusia to India. And the Mamluks would stop the Mongols in Syria in Ain Jalut in 1260, and therefore the Mongols did not come to Egypt. And after the fall of Baghdad, the remaining science moved to Egypt under the Mamluks, who did magnificent productions in architecture, as you can see here, or in getting others, such as the Knights of Malta, to help with this fortification in Alexandria, or the great mosque of Al-Azhar. And this is the exterior view of Al-Azhar, and these are the gates of Cairo, which would stay. But anyway, that grandeur would not last, for despite the splendor of the early Ottoman Empire, mismanagement by Mamluks and Janissaries killed science in the provinces such as Egypt. And from the great golden period of the Muslim world, the torch passes to Europe and the Renaissance.